security prison built of concrete and steel on an island surrounded by the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay.
This was extreme. No prison in the world that had the type of security that we had here.
For almost 30 years, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was the country's toughest prison, a living hell for high-risk and high-profile troublemakers. Men like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman, Robert Stroud.
The purpose of Alcatraz was actually to completely isolate some of America's worst. If you broke the rules or broke the law, you went to prison. If you broke the rules in prison, you came to Alcatraz.
It's a prison where every inmate learns one thing. There is no way out.
Just 4 hours after one of the most daring breaks in the history of the Dallas County.
1933, America is in crisis. The Great Depression and Prohibition unleash a massive crime wave. Criminal syndicates rule the big cities, and gangsters and hoodlums are robbing banks across the country.
We should all be concerned with but one goal, the eradication of crime.
FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover petitions for a supermax prison. In 1934, the Justice Department takes control of Alcatraz Island, a former military prison sitting just over a mile from the city of San Francisco. The goal, create a high-profile facility for the worst of the worst, the toughest of the tough. It becomes a prison that revolutionizes confinement. It aims to punish rather than rehabilitate. Some will survive using their brains or their brawn. Some will fight back, unwilling to give in. Others will break under the strain, and some will make a desperate run for freedom. The prison's first line of defense, cold steel bars. Since at least the 19th century, jails have used metal bars to hold criminals. But as long as there have been prison bars, there have been prisoners clever enough to break through them.
There's very few prisoners at Alcatraz or any other penitentiary, federal or state, that at one time or another doesn't hatch a plot to escape.
The U.S. Army first built the Alcatraz cell house as a military prison in 1909. Like other prisons of the era, Army engineers installed flat steel bars on the cells. The metal itself was strong, but no match for a standard hacksaw blade. Joe Tate is a prison equipment engineer at Southern Folger.
This gives you a nice even place to cut on, a nice flat to cut on. If an inmate takes a hacksaw to this, he'd be out in a couple of days.
When the prison became a federal penitentiary in 1934, officials gave the rock an upgrade, covering the prison with tough, tool-resistant bars that would grind up saw blades.
They've been heat-treated, and what that causes is a carbon buildup in the steel that you can't use a hacksaw to cut this with. If an inmate tries to saw through this, all he'd do is spend his years and years just grinding away.
Over the years, the tough convicts on Alcatraz try every way imaginable to break out. Most attempts failed.
This is case-hardened steel, and it's pretty near impossible to saw through this.
In 1939, one inmate attacks the bars in a unique way. Convicted gangster Arthur Doc Barker, son of the infamous Ma Barker, is a murderer, kidnapper, and armed robber. He receives a life sentence on Alcatraz. A few years later, Doc spots a way out and begins plotting his escape. He's locked up in the D-Block isolation unit. D-Block is one of 2 cell blocks federal authorities failed to upgrade with the tool-resistant bars.
The reason they didn't upgrade the entire cell house to the tool-proof steel was simply a matter of economics. This was an old, aging building, and the money only went so far in the depths of the Depression.
With a smuggled hacksaw blade, Doc and 4 accomplices saw their flat D-Block cell bars so they can enter and leave as they want, hiding the cuts with paint.
They would push them down and then were able to call through.
But Doc and his gang still need to get through the round window bars. These tool-resistant bars are much stronger than the flat bars. The tool-resistant bar is nearly impossible to saw through with a standard saw. The reason? Hardness. A tool-resistant bar has more carbon, which makes the metal harder. When a bar is heat-treated and quickly cooled, the atomic structure shifts, making it more difficult for a blade to cut.
Heat treating has been around for a long time. Any blacksmith who makes horseshoes or a swordsmith has been using it for years and years and years. Hundreds of years.
Thanks to the added carbon and heat treatment, the tool-resistant bars on Alcatraz are about the same level of hardness and strength as a hacksaw blade, the very tool many inmates would use to try to cut the bars.
Whenever one tries to cut something with a material of the same strength or less, it can't do it. It's like trying to cut concrete with concrete. You can't do it. You need something stronger.
Doc's solution is ingenious. He has other cons build and smuggle a bar spreader into the cell house, a crude mechanical device that uses pressure to break the bars.
A bar spreader is essentially like a car jack, and as you crank it and it opens, it's going to put an enormous amount of force on the bars and spread them. They would break because they're fairly brittle compared to mild steel.
January 13th, 1939. Doc and his 4 accomplices slip out of their pre-cut cells and snap the window bars with the bar spreader. Now, outside the cell house, they head to the water and begin building a driftwood raft. Suddenly, guards spot them. Shots ring out, and 4 of the 5 men surrender. But it's too late for Doc.
Doc Barker was shot in the head. He did not make it.
The escape attempt is a tragic failure, but Doc and his associates found a way through the maze of cell house bars. Nearly 24 years later, a determined inmate devises another clever way through the bars.
He was very ingenious in that he used some very simple tools to effect his escape.
John Paul Scott is a convicted armed robber with a troubled history. 3 years after Scott arrives on the Rock, he is working in the Alcatraz kitchen basement. Luckily for Scott, security there is looser than in the rest of the prison.
Down in the kitchen basement, they had a certain amount of time where they can work the bars.
For a few minutes every day, Scott heads to the basement with a variety of tools, including a simple piece of string dipped in floor wax and covered with scouring powder. He methodically saws at one of the window bars. It's a brilliant use of available materials. It takes him more than a year, but he finally cuts through the bars. On December 16th, 1962, Scott and an accomplice, Darrell Parker, make their way through the window and down to the water with another simple tool, rubber gloves. The 2 men make floats and set off from Alcatraz. Parker doesn't get far, but Scott makes it to San Francisco, where he washes up on shore, half frozen.
The cold got to him so badly that he felt like his legs were paralyzed.
Scott was thrown back in prison, another failed attempt to break out of Alcatraz.
It was a good escape strategy, but he was hypothermic by the time he made it to shore.
John Paul Scott is just one of many who try to run from the iron grasp of Alcatraz. Escape becomes an all-consuming ambition to many of its prisoners, all of whom come to grips with its most ruthless security barrier, the freezing currents of the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz, a fearsome concrete penitentiary with tiny cells and dozens of armed guards. One reason Alcatraz is so tough and so effective as a prison is its natural setting. The cold, inhospitable island is surrounded by miles of bone-chilling water.
Well, the water is so rough. This is a very treacherous day out here. When that water is going out, it's dangerous.
When it comes to providing a security barrier, the San Francisco Bay is no ordinary body of water. Alcatraz is more than a mile from land in any direction. The water averages 54 degrees. When it's that low, hypothermia, a dangerous drop in core body temperature that can kill, sets in after only 30 minutes, less time than it takes to swim to land. Dr. Tom Nuckton is an expert on cold water survival.
A competitive swimmer can make that swim between 30 minutes and an hour. An inexperienced swimmer would take longer, possibly over an hour, and that's when hypothermia really becomes a major factor, because the longer you're in the water, the more you're exposed to the cold, and the more likely you are of developing hypothermia.
What's more, Tides in the bay force a tremendous amount of water through the narrow passage of the Golden Gate, more than 2 trillion gallons a day. Because it all has to squeeze through an opening just 1 mile wide, tidal speeds can usually reach over 5 knots, or nearly 6 miles per hour. For inmates who dream of escape, the bay water looms as the toughest obstacle of all. But authorities are confident the island is secure. The intimidating waters of the bay didn't deter Alcatraz's most creative convicts. Numerous attempts were made by some of its most famous inmates. Former public enemy number 1, Floyd Hamilton, hatches a bold plot to secure his freedom. Floyd Hamilton grew up in Texas with the notorious crime couple, Bonnie and Clyde. He starts as their getaway driver and graduates to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. In 1938, authorities finally arrest Hamilton and throw him in jail for 30 years. His first stop, Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. But after a failed escape attempt, authorities send the infamous inmate to Alcatraz. They hope he stays locked up and out of the headlines. Floyd Hamilton's strategy is to blend in. His good behavior earns him a coveted prison privilege, a job in the prison industries building making cement blocks. Hamilton knows the guards will not hesitate to shoot, but he has 2 advantages on his side. The industries building is located near the edge of the island, with easy access to the water. Even better, the building is L-shaped. Tower guards can only supervise 1 section at a time, leaving other sections unguarded.
The industries building probably was one of the less secure buildings on the island. I think it was absolutely tempting that they were right on the edge of the island, and it must have looked so attractive to just simply get out of the building and get into the water and get away.
While at work, Hamilton and his accomplices, bank robber James Borman, kidnapper and bank robber Harold Brest, and kidnapper Fred Hunter, secretly saw a steel mesh window and prepare to make their move. Then on April 13th, 1943, when guards leave them unattended, Hamilton and the others seize the moment. The convicts grab a work knife and hammer and wait. As the guards enter, the inmates attack. They tie them up and race for freedom.
You're probably always thinking, well, we made it this far.
Hamilton's gang quickly climbs out the window, drops down to the water below, and swims for it. Through the fog, a tower guard sees them and raises his rifle to shoot. He shoots and kills James Borman. Harold Brest is caught by his side. Fred Hunter hides inside a cave, but soon gives up. Unseen by the guards, Hamilton takes refuge in an island cave where he is trapped by the icy water and battering waves.
You're freezing, you're uncomfortable, the water is pushing you back, and so his chances of escape were nil. And for all he knew, he was going to die there.
After 3 days of hiding and exposure, Hamilton is exhausted. There is no way he can swim to freedom. Instead, he crawls back up to the prison and gives up.
I've talked to Floyd Hamilton, Clyde Johnson, the guys are in the water, and it's cold water. It was a fortress, you couldn't get out of here. There's no way, and even try that water.
These Alcatraz escapees were clever. They were defeated by the San Francisco Bay and by the guards' use of deadly force. One Alcatraz inmate, John Giles, uses his wits and devises a clever plan to overcome the deadly waterway by not swimming it at all. John Giles was a longtime felon with a history of armed robbery, murder, and prison escape. Arriving at Alcatraz in 1935, he begins scheming and dreaming. But to the guards, he behaves like a model inmate.
John Giles was described as a very quiet, almost intellectual prisoner. He was very trusted and actually well-liked by the guards.
Giles's good behavior earns him a job at the Alcatraz docks, sweeping up after new shipments of army laundry. The guards trust him and sometimes leave him unsupervised. For 10 years, he uses the privilege to his advantage to assemble the components of a military uniform.
He probably did have a lot more freedom than the dock workers, who were loading and unloading barges. And Giles put together an Army uniform from military laundry that came over here, and he hid pieces of it, perhaps throughout the dock.
On July 31st, 1945, a visiting Army boat is about to embark, and Giles takes his chance. He puts on his assembled uniform and steps on board. He thinks he is going to San Francisco, and for a few moments, he can almost taste freedom. Instead, the Army boat heads not for San Francisco, but for the isolated military dock on nearby Angel Island. While en route, the Alcatraz guards discover his absence. They chase him down, and when Giles's boat docks, guard Phil Bergen is there to greet him.
When he came marching off, we were there with the handcuffs, and he just took one disgusted look at us and said, "I thought that GD tub was heading for San Francisco." The inmates started calling him wrong way Giles.
Everybody kind of respected the attempt, even though they didn't like it, but they respected it.
Alcatraz once again foils a carefully plotted escape plan. But is the prison truly escape-proof? The answer lies with the most famous escape attempt in Alcatraz history, Frank Morris and Clarence and John Anglin's Great Escape.
When Morris and Anglin made their escape, it broke the myth that Alcatraz is escape-proof, because after all, they're gone. There's no more escape-proof.
Decades after it happened, the 1962 Great Escape still stands out. In a prison full of clever inmates dreaming of freedom, Frank Morris and his crew may top them all. Their daring plan outwits nearly every element of the Alcatraz security system.
You must understand that these inmates are confined in the cell 24 hours a day. They're out thinking you all the time. A correctional officer comes in, puts his 8 hours, and he goes home and he forgets about it. They're way ahead of us all the time.
But was it the perfect escape? Despite a 17-year FBI manhunt that ends with no definitive answer, questions still remain as to how they beat Alcatraz's security. First, the bars and the concrete. Early on, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers realize it is almost impossible to get through the heat-treated cell bars on the sliding front doors. Instead, they work on the ventilation grills in the back of their cells, drilling small holes in the concrete.
They used forks and spoon handles, and you have to remember that they're not like what you have in your drawer at home today. They were old heavy-gauge steel from the turn of the last century.
Next, the locks. To get out of the cell house, the inmates need keys from the heavily guarded gun gallery. It's an enormous hurdle, so they find a different way out, through the roof.
Frank Morris was always credited with being one of the masterminds of this escape. In actuality, it was really Alan West who saw the route and got everybody up here.
A convicted car thief doing cell house maintenance, West works on top of cell block B when he finds an unsealed vent leading to the roof. Even though West never joins the actual escape, his discovery means the inmates can avoid the cell house doors, locks, and keys.
He saw that there was a blower here over B block, and he figured, and he was absolutely right, that that vent wasn't sealed.
As with other Alcatraz escape attempts, the water is where things might have come apart. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers come up with an ingenious plan: a rubber raft and life jackets. They stitch raincoats together and seal them with glue. But there is one important limitation.
The first time that you could actually test the raft was the night you're getting in the water. And of course, you're getting in a homemade raft in the dark.
In all likelihood, the makeshift raft gives way en route to land, dumping the three inmates into the cold, dark water. At this point, the inmates would be in trouble. Coast Guard records from that night show the water temperature was between 50 and 54 degrees, and the three men would have been completely unprepared, thanks to a key decision by prison authorities.
They reportedly had the shower water in Alcatraz kept warm, actually a bit warmer than normal, and that was to prevent the convicts from acclimatizing to cold water.
The escape plan's next possible flaw? The tides. Investigators believe the inmates entered the water at around 11 p.m. on June 11, 1962. Records from the U.S. Army Engineers Office for that time show an outgoing tide of about 2 knots, or 2.3 miles per hour, the men would be pulled slowly but surely out to sea. If the raft went down, the 3 inmates would have been fighting for their lives at night in very cold water with only homemade life jackets to keep them afloat. Then the relentless outgoing tide would have pulled them further out before they could reach the shore.
So what I think most likely happened is they did become hypothermic. I think eventually, within an hour to 2 hours, they were probably unable to keep themselves above water and they drowned.
Some argue that the inmates could have survived the swim, and over the years, many people, from young to old, try to swim from Alcatraz to shore and succeed. Most are experienced swimmers who grease up for insulation or wear wetsuits, and they have one more advantage the inmates never had.
Most competitive events are done at slack tide so that the athletes don't have to deal with the current.
In the end, there's no proof the raft didn't work. Yet there's no confirmed sighting of Frank Morris, John, or Clarence Anglin on land.
The reason I think they made it, why they got away, was because everybody else that tried to get off this island was accounted for. Those 3 guys are still unaccounted for today. So that makes me think they got away.
I think they got in that water and their raft failed and they were suddenly swimming in an outgoing tide. And that's not a good scenario. It's very cold. It's not likely that they made it, particularly when you can reduce the entire escape to 2 facts. There were no bodies found in the bay and there was no trace on land.
It's one of the enduring mysteries of Alcatraz, and one that may never be solved. But the question still lingers. What would make someone go to such lengths to escape? The answer lies within these walls. To hardened criminals around the country, the name Alcatraz intimidates. What design and security measures made this prison so tough? The answer is more than just physical, but mental. To the convicts, one answer was all around them: the cold confines of their prison cells. At Alcatraz, hardened criminals like Whitey Thompson also fight for their sanity. Whitey arrived on Alcatraz in 1958. He had a track record of 33 bank robberies. He was not prepared for the rock.
It wasn't even existing because to me it's like time has stopped. It was dead. Nothing meant anything anymore.
During his days of crime, Darwin Coon was a reckless young man. He robs 5 banks in the Midwest and escapes from the Nevada State Penitentiary. But at Alcatraz, isolation and boredom wear Coon down.
This is 127. This is where I spent 4 years of my life. It just starts to squeeze you, starts to close in on you. And I guess it's from the fact that you're in such a small area and not allowed to go any further. You lose the sense of reality, and you wonder whether you're part of the real world.
Tough guys on the outside, now on the inside. Every inmate on Alcatraz, from celebrity gangster to back page bad guy, face a new world with new rules. The challenge: adapt, conform, and survive. But some suffer a complete physical, mental, and emotional breakdown. To survive America's Devil's Island, even the country's most notorious gangsters have to adapt. They are big shots on the outside, but on the inside, they are just another inmate. 1920s Chicago. Al Capone, a wealthy mobster with a vicious mean streak, rules the city. Through murder and manipulation, he stays one step ahead of the law. Then, in 1929, the police arrest him for carrying a concealed weapon. They sentence him to a year inside Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. With no opposition from the warden, Capone transforms his primitive cell into a luxury suite, complete with rugs, elegant furniture, and a state-of-the-art radio. Following his sentence, Capone is free for a year and a half, then convicted for evading over $200,000 in taxes. This time, authorities sentence him to 11 years in prison. First, it is 2 years in Atlanta. Then authorities decide to separate, isolate, and control the infamous gangster. His new destination? Alcatraz.
He was completely cut off, completely isolated from his other crime leaders that he had worked with.
Alcatraz is designed to break its inmates, even street thugs like Al Capone. The key factors: a mind-numbing routine, a strict disciplinarian warden, and numerous guards steeled against corruption. Their objective is punishment, not rehabilitation. In a prison where every con is treated the same, Capone's formerly glamorous reputation and wealth make him a target for constant threats and attack. Convicted bank robber John Decker spends 4.5 years on Alcatraz in the 50s.
Al Capone was out here. I mean, he was a big man, but he was Al Capone. That's all he was. Nobody come out here that I ever seen that impressed anybody else. We were all about the same. He had nothing special out here.
Cut off from his fame, his fortune, his friends and power, Al Capone transforms. The former gangster gives up attempts of manipulation and chooses to blend in, doing his time like the others as a common criminal. He works in the laundry, even joins the prison band. Yet as time passes, he retreats further into his tiny cell, alone and miserable. By 1938, the 4th year of his sentence, Capone is a shell of a man.
Capone's condition degraded seriously while he was on Alcatraz. He's got no power. He was stripped of everything. And I think it had to have been very discouraging.
It turns out Al Capone is more than just beaten by punishment. He has an advanced case of syphilis. Before long, he is at times incoherent and partially paralyzed. Alcatraz authorities ship him to a prison hospital in Southern California, and in 1939 release him to freedom. 8 years later, Capone is dead, broken by his time on Alcatraz and his illness. The demoralizing environment has harsh effects on most of the inmates at Alcatraz, even the infamous George Machine Gun Kelly. During the 1930s, his wild crime spree captures the nation's attention until federal agents capture him. He ends up on Alcatraz with a life sentence. Inside his tiny cell, he relives his glory days with endless stories. His cell neighbor, convicted bank robber and multiple prison escapee, Willie Radke.
Now, I slept here, 240, Kelly slept here. This is 230, this is his old cell. Like I say, George had a sense of humor. He was always talking about these blondes and Cadillac cars. That was a big story about him. He was a storyteller. He'd say, did I tell you the time I was down in New Orleans, I had a new Cadillac car and a blonde? I said, yes, you did, George. Well, let me tell you about it. He's going to get out. He's going to go down to California, that blonde in a Cadillac car. That's all he ever dreamt about.
Despite the big stories, Machine Gun Kelly is losing hope. During his 17 miserable years on Alcatraz, the infamous mobster comes to feel deep remorse for his crimes and eventually despair. The Rock beats him down and leaves him a common criminal. Transferred to Leavenworth Federal Prison, Kelly dies in 1954 of a heart attack. The cold confines of Alcatraz are secured by state-of-the-art metal bars and surrounded by the deadly currents of the San Francisco Bay. This island supermax, however, has even more horrors in store for those serving a sentence inside its concrete walls. Convicts who break the rules while at Alcatraz are put in solitary, the notorious D Block, where inmates who have already lost their freedom try to hold on to their grip on reality. Alcatraz has many levels of hell. The top tiers of its D Block is one of them, containing long-term isolation cells for convicts. These inmates are confined to their cells with only one visit to the rec yard per week. On the ground level are closed front cells known as the Hole. These barely lit chambers challenge any inmate's survival instincts. Jim Quillen is given 19 days in the Hole for attempted escape. To cope, he has to use sheer ingenuity.
I had a gimmick that I would, as soon as I'd come in here, I'd pull a button off my coveralls. I would flip it, shut my eyes, turn around in circles, then get down on my hands and knees and see if I could find a button. And I would do this over and over and over and over again until my arms and my hands and my knees would get so sore I couldn't find it. I couldn't stand it anymore. And then I would do it again.
The worst punishment in D Block? The strip cell. Here there is no heat, no light, and the inmate wears no clothes. This cold, dark steel box pushes many men to the edge.
When they close that door, you're in total darkness.
This was total, complete isolation from the world. And the big thing to do was to keep yourself from going insane in here.
To make it through the days of deprivation, prisoners here need mental toughness. Darwin Kuhn is dealt 29 days in the hole for carrying a homemade knife called a shiv. His survival strategy? Somehow stay warm.
That's all you wear is a pair of boxers. You have no bedding, sleep on a steel floor, and it's cold. And there's no way in here to get warm other than running in place or doing calisthenics. When I slept, I tried to keep as much of my body off in the steel as I could, so to stay warm. Like I said, it's total misery, and it's just like you're not a real person. You're kind of just existing.
It's a real mental struggle to keep yourself together. I mean, you want to scream, you want to cry, and believe it, many a time you cry in here.
The hole, the strip cell, and lower solitary are all forms of short-term punishment. For the most dangerous and most violent offenders who need to be separated from the prison population, there is one more punishment: permanent isolation. On the Rock, one prisoner experienced it more than all the others. His name, Robert Stroud, better known as the Birdman of Alcatraz.
Robert Stroud is different from the other prisoners. He didn't become famous because he was a criminal. He actually became famous because he was a prisoner.
Robert Stroud's life is a series of violent encounters. In 1909, 18-year-old Stroud murders a man in Alaska. His punishment, 12 years in a federal prison. Ending up at Leavenworth, Stroud murders a prison guard. He earns the death sentence, but a presidential pardon converts the sentence to a life in prison, served entirely in solitary.
He ended up being in segregation for the next 43 years, which is a lot like being stuck in your bedroom for 43 years.
Stroud spends the next 2 decades in Leavenworth isolation. To survive, he lives in the world of his mind, writing books about birds and keeping flocks of them in his cell. He is a difficult prisoner, and in 1942, authorities shipped Stroud to Alcatraz to keep him under control.
The Birdman was dangerous, there's no question about it. He had already murdered 2 people.
For Robert Stroud, isolation on Alcatraz is a completely different world. The warden puts Stroud in permanent deep lockdown in the 2nd floor prison hospital. No birds, and no way to cause trouble. He is almost entirely cut off from human interaction, except for visits from the guards.
This is Robert Stroud's cell. I used to play checkers with him to these bars from 12 midnight to 8 in the morning. The door was kept closed except to feed him 3 times a day. Other than that, he could not talk to anybody.
Stroud stays in Alcatraz isolation for 17 long years. He immerses himself in books on language and law, but as the years pass, the troubled convict's mind begins to deteriorate.
He would shave his face, he would shave his head, then he would shave his whole body.
So the shaving of his body, I'm guessing that it was a way for him to control the overwhelming anxiety and maintain his mental stability.
For nearly 2 decades, Robert Stroud is a cell house ghost, a legend the other inmates hardly talk about and rarely see. Surviving Alcatraz for most prisoners, whether in a cell in D Block or in isolation, challenges their physical and mental prowess. Some come apart and finally snap.
Let me out of here!
Alcatraz, a supermax prison that keeps its inmates locked up physically and emotionally. Cut off from the rest of the world and sometimes each other, despair seeps through its cold walls and settles into its convicts. Among island prisons, Alcatraz is unique. A maximum security prison sitting right next to the city of San Francisco. For the inmates, the proximity only adds to their misery.
I also remember the Golden Gate Bridge out there. And it used to just feel strange to me. Here I am, looking out this window at that bridge, and these hundreds of cars are going back and forth over that bridge, and not a one of them out there in that world even know I exist.
While imprisoned at Alcatraz, notorious bank robber Henry Young is also tormented by the confines of the island prison. In 1939, Young, Rufus McCain, and 3 other inmates are caught during an escape attempt. They are punished with more than a year of isolation. Young blames McCain for the failed escape. Alone and bitter and mentally fractured, Young becomes more and more enraged. He focuses on plotting his revenge. After 2 years in isolation, the warden releases Henry Young back to his normal cell. Young gets a job in the Model Industries building. He seems stable, but deep inside, he is absorbed with payback. Despite the consequences, on December 3rd, 1940, Henry Young loses control, snaps, and brutally stabs and kills Rufus McCain.
I think the crime has to be attributed to psychological effects of that solitary confinement. He had mounting anxiety, mounting rage that he didn't think he could control. He was somewhat disoriented. His judgment was less than adequate. And for all those reasons, he was sort of predisposed to doing something extreme and not very rational. And then the murder happened.
One night in 1938, convicted post office robber Joe Kolonowski also snaps. A guard finds him ramming his skull into a concrete cell wall, trying to knock the noises out of his head. He does not succeed and has a psychotic break.
Human beings require a certain amount of social interaction in order to maintain their mental health. If you take all of those things away, they tend to fall apart.
Get the doctor!
Most disturbing of all is the story of Rue Percival. In 1937, this convicted kidnapper snaps while on garbage detail. He chops at his hand with an axe, cutting off most of his fingers. Reduced to a babbling madman, he is transferred to the Alcatraz hospital.
He chopped off his fingers, and that was an extreme act. Prisoners do extreme acts, and often it's to get attention for themselves. So that's a very sad state of affairs.
Another expression of mental breakdown on Alcatraz is the unexplained and futile escape attempt of post office robber Joe Bowers. Arriving on Alcatraz in 1934, Bowers is a small-time thief among hardened gangsters and violent cons. Crushed by the harsh prison routine, he grows desperate.
My opinion is the man that attempts to escape is the man that's given up on life. They figure that they're tired of that routine and they take a shot at it.
Bowers works at the garbage incinerator right on the island's edge. The temptation is too strong, and on April 27, 1936, Bowers starts over the wire fence. A guard yells for him to stop, then fires 3 shots. Bowers falls 75 feet to his death. He never has a chance.
There were quite a few people that witnessed that and were pretty horrified. But some of the prisoners thought it was murder and others thought it was suicide.
It is likely Joe Bowers knew he would be shot trying to escape, but he also knew he could not bear life on Alcatraz. For 29 long years, the nation's worst criminals faced life and death on the Rock. Kidnappers, gangsters, murderers, and robbers alike each face misery and daunting punishment. Thanks to its notorious inmates and perilous escape attempts, the Alcatraz legend lives on. Released inmates tell the tale that for prisoners at Alcatraz, there was no way out.